A quiet scream echoed from the floor no one dared to enter. A sound dismissed. A shadow forgotten. A truth buried behind walls. But some secrets press against the silence until they bleed through dust and lies. In this tale, every locked door hides more than just emptiness. It hides the weight of pride, the price of cowardice, and the echo of a vanished uniform. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments below. Let's begin the story. It was upon a particularly chill December evening that I found myself once again in the familiar embrace of our sitting room at 221B Baker Street. Outside, the fog lay heavy upon the windows, its ghostly breath curling along the glass panes like the sigh of a sleeping city. The fire crackled with modest enthusiasm, and Holmes, in one of his more reflective moods, sat languidly across from me, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, and his keen grey eyes half closed in thought. There had been no clients that day, a rarity, and I, for once, indulged in the rare luxury of silence, punctuated only by the occasional rustle of the Morning Post, or the clink of china as Mrs. Hudson brought up our tea. Holmes had not spoken in nearly an hour, save for a sardonic remark on the political follies in the Balkan states, and even then only in passing. I confess I had rather begun to believe that the evening would drift into unremarkable tranquillity. I had resumed my seat by the fire with a volume of Addison when Holmes stirred, reached for an envelope that lay crumpled near the grate, and examined it with a sudden glint in his eye, a glint I had come to know well. It was the light that presaged deduction. The stillness of the room had only been the pause before the opening act. Something, as ever, had caught Sherlock Holmes's interest. Holmes held the envelope delicately between his thumb and forefinger, tilting it toward the firelight with the air of a man examining an ancient manuscript. The paper was of average quality, creamstock, lightly stiffened, and the writing, though precise, bore unmistakable signs of haste. But it was the smear across the lower left corner that drew Holmes's particular scrutiny, a muddy crescent of ink interrupted by a faint thumbprint. "Observe, Watson," he said, his tone almost indulgent. "This is not merely a discarded envelope. It is a confession of carelessness, panic, and something else altogether." I leaned forward, drawn as always to the theatricality of Holmes's revelations. He continued without prompting. "The ink is India blue, not commonly used except by clerks or draftsmen. The smear suggests that the envelope was sealed with undue speed, perhaps in flight or distress. And note the angle of the script, slanted downward, as though written while standing. But here," he tapped the stamp, "is the most curious element. It is affixed with the wrong denomination. Either the sender was unaware or unconcerned." "And what does it suggest to you?" I asked. "That we shall, before the hour is out, be visited by someone who writes standing in a corridor, perhaps with trembling hands, and who values urgency above correctness." Before I could reply, there came a knock at the door, 3 sharp raps, nervous in rhythm. Holmes smiled without turning. And there, if I am not mistaken, is our visitor. She stood at the threshold of our parlour like an apparition conjured by Holmes's prophecy. Her figure was slight, clad in a weather-stained wool coat, and though her features bore the ordinary cast of a modestly bred woman, her eyes betrayed something altogether different, raw, unguarded terror. Her gloves, cheap kid leather, were stained with dark blotches that could only be blood. "I beg your pardon, gentlemen," she said, in a voice tight with restraint. I fear something dreadful has happened, and no one will believe me." Holmes gestured toward the armchair nearest the hearth. "You are among those who listen without prejudice. Please take your time. Begin at the beginning." She did not sit immediately, but instead removed her gloves with trembling fingers. I saw now the bruising along the base of her thumb and a streak of red that had dried along the edge of her palm. "My name is Eliza Merton," she began. "I am a schoolteacher. I live in a boarding house on Marchman Street. Last night—" Her voice faltered, and I leaned forward, gently encouraging. She swallowed and met Holmes's gaze. "I believe a man was murdered in the flat above mine, but when I called for help, they told me the room was empty." Eliza Merton's tale emerged haltingly, as though each word carried with it a weight she had borne in silence. "It was past midnight," she said, "and I had just extinguished my lamp when I heard a scream. Not a cry of alarm, mind you, but something final. It came from directly above my ceiling." "And the flat above yours?" Holmes inquired. "Supposedly vacant," she replied. "The landlady insists the 6th floor has been shut for repairs for weeks. But I saw someone enter it at dusk. A tall man. I only caught the shape of him. Shoulders squared, his gait purposeful." Watson here interjected gently, "And what happened when you reported it?" Her hands gripped the hem of her coat. "Mrs. Bracker, the landlady, dismissed it at once. Said I'd been dreaming. The other tenants claimed to have heard nothing. I knocked on the 6th floor door myself, no answer, but I know what I heard." Holmes steepled his fingers. "And yet, when you entered the flat—" "I couldn't. The door was locked. This morning it remained so. But that scream, it has not left my ears." For a moment, the room fell into silence, save for the pop of the fire. Holmes's eyes shone like steel in the dim. A locked room, a vanished man, and a scream in the night. "Yes, Miss Merton, I believe you." Miss Eliza Merton sat with the composed bearing of one who has long endured the polite dismissals of a society that mistakes silence for meekness. There was nothing outwardly remarkable in her appearance. A plain felt hat, gloves now folded in her lap, and the modest garments of a governess or instructor of children. But beneath her mild exterior there stirred the tremors of recent shock and a mind battling against disbelief, not her own, but that of others. "I teach at the Langston School for Girls," she said, her voice still retaining the clarity of the classroom. "It is a respectable institution, and I rent a room nearby, on the 2nd floor of a house in Marchman Street. Nothing grand, but it has served me well for over a year. The house itself is tall and narrow, as many are with 6 floors, though the uppermost has long been deemed unusable, or so I was told." Holmes made a faint motion, urging her on, though his eyes had not left her face for a moment. "I am not one to invite attention," she added softly, "but I could not rest knowing what I heard, what I felt, had been so swiftly dismissed. It is not the fear of madness that brought me here, Mr. Holmes, but the knowledge that something terrible has occurred, and no one else will listen." At that, Holmes shifted slightly in his chair, the gleam in his gaze sharpening like steel drawn from a sheath. "I had just prepared for bed," Miss Merton continued, "and had extinguished the lamp beside my reading chair when I heard it, a cry that tore through the ceiling above, with such intensity that I stood rooted to the spot. It was not a mere exclamation or quarrel. It was the sound of a man in his final agony." Her hands gripped the arms of the chair now, knuckles pale beneath her gloves. There was a silence afterward, complete, unnatural. Not even the creak of floorboards or the wind against the eaves. It was as if the house itself held its breath. Holmes glanced at me briefly, and I noted the familiar tightening of his mouth, the signal that he was now assembling his mental map of the scene. "You are certain it came from the 6th floor?" he asked. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "I lived directly below it. The cry was almost overhead. I rushed to the staircase and looked upward, but the landing above was dark. I dared not go further that night. In the morning, I ventured to the 6th floor door, but it was locked. I roused Mrs. Bracker, the landlady. She only laughed. "Elaborate, if you please," Holmes murmured. "She said I must have been dreaming, that the floor was shut for repairs and no one had been there in weeks. But I know what I heard, Mr. Holmes. I would stake my very soul upon it. And it is that very certainty, Holmes replied, which makes you worth listening to. Miss Merton's narrative grew more methodical now, as though she were reliving each moment with the detachment of a teacher recalling a lesson plan. When Mrs. Bracker dismissed my concerns, I thought perhaps the other tenants had heard the same and would confirm it. But when I questioned them, first Mr. Langley, then Colonel Hargrave, and finally young Timothy, the hall boy, they each professed to have heard nothing out of the ordinary. And their manner, I asked. She gave a small, rueful smile, polite, but distant. Mr. Langley appeared quite distracted. He is an artist, I believe, and offered little more than vague agreement with Mrs. Bracker's claims. Colonel Hargrave, who lives on the floor above mine, seemed almost annoyed by my inquiry. He said I should not let female nerves get the better of me. As for Timothy, he merely looked frightened. Holmes's fingers tapped soundlessly against the arm of his chair. I returned to the 6th floor door later that day, she went on, and found it still locked. The hallway bore the dust of disuse, but there were no signs of structural repair, no plaster dust, no tools. I even inquired with a builder in the area, and he stated plainly that no works had been scheduled for that address. A locked room, Holmes mused, in a house filled with open denials. Curious indeed. And yet, I added, someone had to be lying. Holmes did not reply, but the faint narrowing of his eyes signalled that his mind had already passed into deeper waters. There is one more thing, Miss Merton said, her voice now low and measured. It was just before the sun set on the evening before the scream. I had returned home early from a faculty meeting and was drawing the curtains when I looked up the stairwell and saw a man. Holmes leaned forward ever so slightly. Describe him. She nodded. He was tall, broad-shouldered. His coat was dark, and his hat sat low on his brow. He carried himself not as a vagrant, nor as one unfamiliar with the place. He climbed the stairs slowly, but deliberately, and paused on the 6th floor landing. Then he disappeared from view. Did he see you? I asked. I do not believe so. I only glimpsed him through the banister, but I have no doubt he entered the 6th floor flat. Holmes rose from his chair then and stood facing the fire, his back to us both. When he finally spoke, it was as though he were reciting from memory. One man seen ascending to a locked and supposedly empty floor. A scream heard from the same room hours later. A group of tenants professing ignorance. A landlady offering deflection. And a young woman whose only crime is that she listened when others chose silence. He turned, the flames catching in his eyes. Miss Merton, I believe your instincts are sound. Watson and I shall call upon your lodgings this very evening. And with that, the course of the case was set into motion. It was scarcely past 4 o'clock that same afternoon when Holmes and I presented ourselves at the narrow front steps of the boarding establishment on Marchman Street. Holmes, in his more reticent moods, was never one to announce himself grandly, and on this occasion he adopted the posture of a weary commercial clerk in search of temporary lodging. I, for my part, assumed the role of his companion, newly arrived from the provinces and afflicted with a lingering cough. The ruse was a simple one, but effective. The landlady, Mrs. Bracker, a woman of stout frame and efficient manner, greeted us with polite indifference. Her spectacles perched precariously at the end of a nose that had clearly weathered many winters. The mention of our interest in a 2nd-floor room, vacated only the week prior, was met with the perfunctory tour, followed by a rather hasty request for a week's advance rent paid in cash. Holmes obliged with a crisp note from his inside coat pocket. Within 10 minutes we had secured not only a room on the same floor as Miss Merton, but also a most advantageous position from which to observe the comings and goings of the house's inhabitants. Holmes remarked, once we were alone, that the hallways bore the scent of boiled cabbage and pipe ash, though in his estimation, the latter was of a particularly distinctive blend. "The walls are thin," he murmured as he tapped once on the panel nearest our window. "And secrets, like smoke, have a tendency to drift." Thus embedded, we commenced our quiet investigation, beginning with the landlady herself. Holmes sought out Mrs. Bracker under the pretext of inquiring whether any work was to be done upon the upper floors that might disturb a man of fragile nerves, his invented malady, to which he now added a dramatic wince and a reference to childhood inflammation of the ear. To her credit, the landlady remained composed. "The 6th floor," she said with a smile that did not quite reach the eyes. "Oh, no, sir. Closed entirely. Rotten beams. Mr. Collins, that was the last gentleman who stayed up there, left nearly 6 weeks ago. Haven't had the workmen in just yet. Planning to by spring. Curious," Holmes replied, glancing upward with studied nonchalance. "Dust does tend to accumulate in such spaces, I imagine." Mrs. Bracker chuckled dutifully, her hands busily drying a teacup with the hem of her apron. "Not much to see up there, really. You'll be much happier where you are. Good view of the street. Quiet neighbours. And no disturbances of any kind?" "Not a whisper." As we returned to our room, Holmes said nothing for several minutes. Then, quite suddenly, he remarked, "She dries teacups that were never washed. The movement of her hands is habitual, not functional. That is the gesture of a woman too used to hiding her true occupation behind domestic pretense." "You suspect her of deception?" I asked. "I suspect her of knowing more than she admits," Holmes replied, "which is, in this house, tantamount to complicity." Our next encounter was with Colonel Hargrave, whose lodgings were just above our own on the 3rd floor. A knock at his door was answered briskly, and we were invited in with the peremptory air of a man who considers social interruption a form of civilian encroachment. He stood tall, his bearing still unmistakably martial despite the softening effects of retirement. A sabre hung on the wall above a modest hearth, and the faint aroma of strong cigar smoke clung to the room like a veteran's shadow. Holmes expressed a neighbourly interest in the house's history, particularly its upper floors. "The 6th?" Hargrave snorted. "Quite unfit, I assure you. Bracker's let it fall into disrepair. Ghastly plumbing and drafts besides. Can't imagine anyone spending a night up there willingly." His tone was final, yet Holmes pressed on with careful diplomacy. "And you've heard nothing unusual? No disturbances?" Hargrave's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. "I keep to myself. I do not concern myself with the nervous fancies of others." With that, he turned back to his reading chair and dismissed us with a curt nod. Outside the room, Holmes paused at the threshold and drew in a slow breath. "You noted the ash on the floor?" he said. "Cuban, I believe, recently tapped, and yet he had not touched the cigar during our visit. You think he was interrupted?" "I think he was expecting someone else." In the fading light of that same day, I encountered Timothy, the hall boy, as he swept the stairs leading to the upper floors. A quiet child, perhaps 12 or 13, with trousers slightly too short and shoes worn at the heel, he carried himself with the furtiveness common to those who have learned to remain invisible in the presence of adults. I crouched beside him and spoke in the gentlest tone I could manage. "Timothy, may I ask you a question? Has anyone gone up to the 6th floor recently?" The boy did not reply, but his broom paused mid-sweep. His gaze flicked upward toward the narrow stairwell, then back to the bristles in his hand. "No one's supposed to," he mumbled finally. "But someone did." He hesitated, then nodded. Once, almost imperceptibly, before turning and hurrying down the stairs, abandoning his broom behind him. When I recounted the moment to Holmes, he merely nodded. Children are often poor liars and excellent listeners, he said. He knows something, and more importantly, he knows it is dangerous to say it aloud. Our final visit of the day was to Mr. Langley, a reclusive artist whose quarters were a chaos of canvases, charcoals, and half-finished portraits leaning precariously against the walls. He received us with evident reluctance, his long fingers stained with ink and something darker that might have been oil, or something else entirely. "I'm not much for company," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the clutter. "Deadlines, commissions, that sort of thing." Holmes offered a mild smile. "Forgive the intrusion, Mr. Langley. We are simply acquainting ourselves with our new neighbours. A beautiful light you have here." Langley did not respond. His eyes darted about the room, as though measuring our presence against some private calculus. Holmes's gaze, meanwhile, took in every inch of the flat. The fresh gouge in the floorboards, the smell of ash, the ragged edge of a military sash half hidden beneath a drape. "Do you paint from imagination or from life?" Holmes asked abruptly. Langley blinked. "From memory, mostly. Though some faces do stay longer than they ought." There was something fragile about him, like glass under tension. As we left, I asked Holmes what he had observed. "He is frightened, and not of us," Holmes replied. "That studio holds more than art, and if I am not mistaken, that sash once belonged to a uniform." Later that evening, Holmes and I ascended the stair to the 6th floor under the pretext of examining a creaking water pipe that Mrs. Bracker had claimed ran along the top landing. The hallway was dim and heavy with disuse, the air stale and thick with the scent of time itself. Holmes knelt beside the landing's edge and gestured silently. There, half obscured by dust, was a single footprint, larger than Miss Merton's, with a heavier heel and a telltale tread. "Recent," Holmes murmured, his fingers lightly tracing the disturbed debris, "and made by a man unaccustomed to hiding his presence." He stood slowly and drew in a breath, the expression on his face sharpening with intent. "Someone ascended after the scream," he said, "and that someone expected not to be followed." We moved toward the end of the corridor, where the sealed door stood like a sentinel. Holmes paused, crouched, and extracted something from a splinter along the door frame, a single thread, scarlet in hue. "Wool," he said, "military weave, and not long detached." I caught the faintest scent then, sharp, acrid, and familiar. "Cigar smoke," Holmes confirmed. "Recent. Our colonel, perhaps, or someone wishing to resemble him." He tapped once upon the locked door. "The room is silent, but it is not empty," he said, and with that cryptic pronouncement, we descended the stairs into the deepening twilight of the house. Once returned to Baker Street, Holmes wasted no time in turning to his small cabinet of chemical reagents and magnifying instruments. The red thread he had plucked from the door frame was laid upon a glass slide and examined beneath the lens with a meticulousness I had long come to associate with his most fruitful inquiries. "Wool," he murmured, "of a grade not often found in civilian dress. The weave is tight, dyed with cochineal. Notice the slight sheen, indicates ceremonial wear, not everyday utility." He straightened and turned toward me, the thread now resting in a small envelope. "It belongs to a military sash, a dress uniform, the sort worn in formal review or court-martial, not on the field." "And how does that assist us?" I asked. "It narrows our quarry to a very specific breed," he replied. "One who either once wore honour or now wears only the memory of it. A man with knowledge of regimental attire and access to it still." He crossed to the desk and opened a folder already half filled with notations and sketches. "This case is not merely murder," he said. "It is concealment practiced with military discipline. The silence of the house, the evasions of its residents, they are too coordinated to be coincidence. Someone is commanding from within. He tapped the envelope lightly. And like many commanders, he has left behind a bit of his colours. I said nothing, but watched as he placed the thread beside the smudged envelope from days prior. One had revealed urgency, the other, origin. We were drawing nearer to the centre of the storm. With a swift precision born of urgency, Holmes composed a telegram upon his notepaper, his quill scratching across the surface like the whisper of a blade. To Inspector Lestrade, Scotland Yard, he dictated aloud as he wrote. Request immediate dispatch of names and records of any officer or enlisted man dishonourably discharged within the past 24 months. Narrow search to those who served in ceremonial capacity with access to dress uniform. Further restrict to individuals presently known or believed to be residing in London. He folded the paper crisply, placed it within an envelope, and handed it to me. See that this reaches the telegraph office immediately, Watson. We cannot afford delay. As I stepped into the cold evening and made my way to the nearest wire office, I reflected once more on the curious elegance of Holmes's mind. Always reaching, always pruning the chaos of the world into narrower rings of truth. He saw, in fibres and smudges, what others could not see in whole scenes. By the time I returned, he had resumed his seat by the fire, violin idle upon his knee, eyes fixed on the coals. He did not look up when I entered. Now, he said quietly, we wait for the shadow to move. It was not long before the next tremor arrived, though it came not by telegram, but by trembling hand. Miss Eliza Merton returned that very night, her breath uneven and her gloves forgotten, her cheeks pale with terror that had not yet found words. Holmes rose at once. Miss Merton? She gripped the back of the chair, her voice scarcely audible. He was there. Holmes guided her to sit, his manner now firm yet gentle. Who? I don't know, she said, the words spilling now. I had gone to draw the curtain in my room just after sundown, and I looked up, out of habit, toward the 6th floor window. There was a face. Holmes did not interrupt. It vanished the instant I saw it, but I swear to you, Mr. Holmes, it was real. A man's face, gaunt and pale, looking down through the cracked glass. He was watching. Could you describe him? I asked gently. No, she whispered. Only that he had eyes like cold water, still, but full of depth, and he did not blink. Holmes's hands were steepled once more, but his eyes had kindled to steel. You understand now, he said, turning to me. We are no longer observers. We are on the board. Miss Merton shuddered. I thought I had imagined the scream. But he was real. He is real. And he is still in that house. Holmes said nothing further, but his gaze turned toward the window and the fog beyond it, watching the watcher. Once Miss Merton had departed, escorted safely to her lodgings under Holmes's quiet insistence that she speak to no one, Holmes paced the length of our parlour with a restlessness I had seen only when the mind outpaced the body. The mistake is always in the assumption of absence, he murmured. We are told the floor is sealed. Therefore, we do not expect a presence. And yet, there he was, staring down like a spider from the rafters. He stopped abruptly and turned to me. There are now 3 certainties. 1. A man is using the 6th floor, clandestinely. 2. Miss Merton heard what she claimed to hear. And 3. We are being observed. What do you propose? I asked. A net, he said simply. But not cast from above, rather from within. He crossed to his desk and retrieved a slip of paper. You, my dear Watson, must return to Marchman Street, not as my colleague, but as a lodger seeking rest after an illness. A name will be arranged, your references forged. Bracker will admit you. She is too eager for Coyne to refuse. I frowned. You would have me play the spy? Holmes offered a rare smile. Only the observer, the eyes she expects to be blind. And what of you? I shall remain invisible, for now, but I shall be near. And so it was settled. The doctor would become the patient, and the hunter would slip into the den. Though I was no stranger to danger, it must be confessed that Holmes's proposition gave me pause. To return alone into a house shrouded in secrets and haunted by whispers, without his immediate presence, was not a task I accepted lightly. But I had long since learned that Holmes did not extend such trust without cause. If I was to serve as his agent in the shadows, then I would do so with resolve. By noon the next day, I stood once again on the stoop of Marchman Street, this time under the alias of Mr. James Renshaw, recently returned from convalescence in Kent. Mrs. Bracker welcomed me with a cursory glance at the forged letter Holmes had prepared, and promptly installed me in a modest room beside Miss Merton's. Holmes's only instruction had been clear: watch, listen, record, speak little, suspect all. As I unpacked my valise, I found his final note tucked into the lining. Observe the Colonel's ashtray, the artist's studio door, and the hall boy's eyes. Truth often hides in plain dust. I placed the note within my diary and turned toward the window. Thus began my tenure as a stranger in a house that knew too much and said too little. It was shortly past 2 o'clock in the morning when I was roused from uneasy slumber by a faint but distinct sound. Dull thumps, muffled as though struck through layers of cloth and floorboard, and spaced with curious deliberation. I had grown accustomed during my medical training to sudden wakings. Yet there was in this disturbance something altogether unnatural, as though each noise bore the hesitance of a man treading in guilt. I sat upright, every sense now sharpened, the chill of the room suddenly more pronounced. The gas lamp flickered feebly in its sconce, and outside, a thin mist curled across the window pane like the fingers of some unseen hand. I rose and stood barefoot upon the boards, straining to listen. The sound had ceased, yet the silence that replaced it was not a peaceful one. It was the silence of breath held, of motion arrested, not absence, but expectation. I pulled on my dressing gown and crept into the corridor. The house was still, yet I sensed a tension that ran through its bones like a wire drawn taut. Step by step, I climbed the stairwell toward the 6th floor, where darkness pressed thicker than below, and the dust of disuse no longer seemed entirely undisturbed. Then I saw it. The door, which had been sealed and locked upon our earlier visits, now stood slightly ajar, its edge casting a crooked shadow on the floor. I hesitated only a moment, then pushed gently upon the wood. It gave without resistance. The room was not large, nor particularly furnished. Bare walls, a cracked basin, a narrow bed with the coverlet thrown back in disarray. Yet what it lacked in comfort, it made up for in menace. The atmosphere was not one of ordinary decay, but of something sullied, something fouled by recent, hasty use. A single lamp flickered in the corner, its glass shade crooked upon its hinge. Dust coated the window-sill, but the centre pane bore the faint trace of a handprint, as though someone had pressed close to it to watch the street below. I stepped further in. Beneath the window lay a rug, roughly woven, the kind one might find in any lodging of modest means. But it was here that my eye was drawn, for the edge had been folded in upon itself, and beneath it I glimpsed a dark stain, coppery, irregular, and cruelly recent. Blood. I knelt and pulled the rug back. There, across the grain of the floorboards, lay a wide spatter of crimson, now half dried and darkened at the edges. Its pattern spoke not of accident, but of violence, of something felled, or struck, or dragged. And then I saw it, beneath the leg of a wooden chair tipped awkwardly to one side. A pair of spectacles, their frame bent, one lens cracked like the webbed window of a carriage lamp. No attempt had been made to conceal them. I stood, heart racing, and turned to the door. Who had been here? And why leave so damning a tableau behind? Whatever the answer, it had been no ghost that cried out in the night. I retrieved the spectacles with great care, wrapping them in my handkerchief before slipping them into the pocket of my robe. The metal was still faintly warm to the touch, a disquieting reminder that I had arrived not long after their abandonment. One arm of the frame had been bent backward, the hinge torn loose with force. The cracked lens bore a smudge of blood where it had likely struck a cheek or brow. The pool beneath the rug was no illusion. I examined it closely, noting that it had begun to congeal at the edges, but remained tacky at the centre. There were drag marks leading toward the wall, yet no sign of a body, no scrap of cloth or trace of hair, beyond what the floor itself had absorbed. There was something savage about the scene, yet also something rehearsed. It was as if the struggle had occurred in silence. No overturned furniture, no broken lamp, only the blood and the ruined spectacles. I returned to the doorway and listened once more. Nothing stirred in the hall. Yet I could not shake the certainty that someone had watched me from beyond that pane, had measured my reaction, gauged my movements. I descended the stairs quietly and returned to my room. Only then did I lock the door behind me and write down, as clearly as I could, every detail I had seen, for Holmes, and for the sake of what conscience demanded. The next morning, after a sleepless stretch of hours marked only by the creak of the walls and the occasional groan of pipe work, I confronted Mrs. Bracker in the narrow galley between the parlour and kitchen. Her expression remained maddeningly placid as I described what I had found. "The 6th floor," she said, with lifted brows. "No, sir. Still closed. Been locked for weeks. No one's been up there." I told her of the open door, the blood, the spectacles. She blinked twice and pursed her lips. "Well now, that's a strange tale. You sure it wasn't just a bit of old paint, or maybe wine? Some lodgers take to wandering. It's not my place to question." "Mrs. Bracker," I said, keeping my voice level, "you know what I saw." She shook her head. "All I know, sir, is what I've been told, and I've been told that floor's not in use." With that, she turned back to her tea kettle, the conversation dismissed like an unworthy suitor. I returned to my room, my temper boiling beneath the skin. She was lying, but to protect whom? The house had closed ranks. Holmes arrived that evening, under the guise of checking in on an ailing friend. The landlady nodded him through without suspicion, though I observed the faint flicker of recognition, or was it unease, in her glance. He said little until we were alone, then gestured for quiet. Producing a pair of gloves, he knelt beside the iron coal scuttle just outside the common hearth. With swift, deliberate motion, he sifted through the half-spent coals and extracted a small envelope, its corners smudged with soot but otherwise intact. Inside, upon a single slip of paper, was scrawled in a tremulous hand, "S. Midnight too late. Bundle must be moved sooner. Door warped. Unsafe." Holmes read the message thrice before speaking. It was hidden well. Whoever placed it here assumed no one would think to look inside the fuel for heat. "Do you believe it was intended for Colonel Hargrave?" Holmes shook his head. "Number Hargrave would never permit such clumsy wording. And he commands, he does not execute." He held the letter toward the lamplight. "This was meant for a subordinate, a frightened one." "An S?" I asked. "Maybe sender or recipient, but the urgency is clear. Something hidden must be retrieved before the house gives way." Holmes folded the note. "Let us see if the yard has answered our knock." Holmes had scarcely tucked the coal bucket letter into his inner coat when a sharp rap came at the door. A uniformed constable, gloved and wind-chapped, presented a sealed note. Holmes thanked him, then broke the wax seal with a swift motion. His eyes scanned the contents, and I saw his brows rise ever so slightly. "Watson," he said, "we have our man. He handed me the paper. I read aloud. 1 Samuel Harker, age 39, dishonourably discharged from the 14th Dragoons for insubordination and assault. Last known address, Whitechapel, suspected of political sympathies, known to wear a ceremonial sash, red wool, retained after dismissal, believed unstable, current whereabouts unknown. The red thread, I murmured. And the discipline, Holmes added. You recall Miss Merton's description? A tall man, deliberate gait, presence of command. He is here, or was. The question now is whether he acts alone. He crossed to the window and peered down at the street below. Samuel Harker has blood on his hands, but not his alone. This house shelters more than shadows, Watson. It harbours a conspiracy. He turned, face set with purpose. And we must smoke it out, before midnight comes again. Holmes sat by the hearth with pen in hand, his features calm, but fixed with that peculiar intensity which always preceded action. The flicker of firelight danced upon the page as he composed a brief but curiously worded letter. I find, he remarked without glancing up, that officialdom often commands more respect when it appears in print. I observed the letter, which bore no signature, only the header of a fictitious structural inspection authority. It was addressed to the editor of the Evening Standard and announced that the property at number 17 Marchman Street would be subject to a full police-supervised inspection regarding concerns of warped beams, loose stonework, and possible illegal subletting. Do you suppose the tenants will read this? I asked. They are not the intended audience, Holmes replied. Our quarry will see the word police and understand the message. His sanctuary is no longer safe. With a final flourish, he folded the letter and pressed it into an envelope. A nest of vipers, Watson, does not scatter when the wind blows. It coils tighter. This little draft should compel one of them to act before they have properly concealed what lies beneath their floorboards. He handed the letter to a messenger boy with a coin and a nod. Then, turning to me with quiet satisfaction, he said, Now let us prepare ourselves for the silence that comes before confession. Late that evening, Holmes arrived at the house under cover of darkness. He tapped twice upon my door, the signal we had agreed upon, and together we made our way to the narrow service passage that wound behind the upper floors. We carried only a lantern, a coil of cord, and Holmes's leather satchel, which contained a selection of tools no less precise for their simplicity. With practiced efficiency, he located a warped panel behind the 6th floor landing, a decorative wainscot, long forgotten beneath flaking paint and dust. Here, he whispered. The servants once used this recess to tend to the gas piping. It affords just enough room for 2 men of a moderate dimensions. And what if he hears us? I asked, as we worked the panel loose. He will not. His mind will be upon haste, not stealth. Men do not rummage calmly beneath floorboards when the gallows approaches. We wedged ourselves within the narrow space, crouched low, our breath shallow. Through a narrow slit, we had a clear view of the upper corridor and the threshold to the very room where the blood had been spilled. Holmes passed me a small notebook. Make no sound, Watson. Record all. We do not yet know who shall arrive, but arrive he shall. Thus began the vigil. Time passed like molasses on glass, the walls thick with silence, the air scented faintly with dust and decay. My heart thudded not with fear, but with anticipation, for something was coming through the dark. It was just past the stroke of midnight when we heard the faintest shift in the floorboards beyond the wall. Holmes touched my sleeve, a silent command, and together we peered through the narrow slit. A shadow moved in the hallway. Hooded, cloaked, the figure advanced with measured steps, his gait betraying neither haste nor full confidence. The stranger paused at the threshold, then entered the very room we had watched for hours. We heard the faint creak of floorboards, the soft scuff of boot against rug, and then a pause. The intruder crouched. With a series of quiet, practiced movements, he peeled back the rug, revealing the scarred planks beneath. Holmes leaned closer. The man produced a tool from within his cloak and began working at the boards. One came loose, then another, and then we heard it. The faint clink of metal, the rustle of fabric. The intruder drew from the cavity a cloth bundle, tied with twine. He unfastened it quickly, revealing the contents beneath the flickering lamplight. A stained coat, its lining darkened with blood, a sheaf of papers bound in ribbon, and a roll of sovereigns wrapped in flannel. Holmes's eyes met mine. "We move now," he mouthed. He sprang from the panel like a thunderclap, landing with both feet upon the boards behind the intruder. "Enough," Holmes said coldly. The man whirled, eyes wide. It was Langley, the artist. For a long moment, Langley did not speak. His hands trembled where they hovered above the bundle, his eyes darting between Holmes and the open doorway behind him. "You," he stammered. "You said you were just neighbours." "I never said anything of the sort," Holmes interrupted, his voice as crisp as frost. "Now kindly rise. You've knelt long enough before false gods." Langley staggered to his feet, the colour draining from his cheeks. "I didn't kill him. I swear it. I was only told to hide it." Holmes gestured toward the bundle. "The coat belongs to Mr. Sutton, does it not? The man whose spectacles were crushed beneath that chair. The man whose blood stains this floor." Langley said nothing. Holmes bent and retrieved the forged papers. "This is a military pass. The ink is fresh. And here, an identity bearing Sutton's name, but Langley's likeness. You were meant to replace him." Langley flinched. "I was paid, that's all." "The coins," Holmes said quietly. "Blood money, and not your first payment, I'd wager." Langley's shoulders slumped. "I never saw the body. I only cleaned after. I didn't ask." "And yet," Holmes replied, "you were trusted with the burial of truth." He turned to me. "Watson, if you would be so good, summon the constable waiting on the corner." Langley did not flee. He merely sat upon the bed and buried his face in his hands, the weight of cowardice heavier than the charge of guilt. With Langley in custody and the bundle secured, we returned briefly to Baker Street before dawn. Holmes said little on the cab ride, his gaze turned toward the misted city streets, as if their secrets still whispered behind him. It was only once the fire had been lit and tea poured that he spoke again. "He is not our man," he said simply. I looked up, startled. "You doubt his guilt?" "I doubt his authorship. He is no killer, Watson, merely a brush in another's hand. Someone else set this tableau, someone with knowledge of Langley's fears and the means to exploit them. But he concealed the evidence. Yes, like a servant who sweeps the blood from the floor, unaware of the name on the blade." Holmes held up the forged identity. "This is too elaborate for Langley alone. The pass is authentic in style, but the signature bears hesitation. He copied it, but he did not originate it. Then the killer still walks the house," Holmes said quietly. "And now he knows we are near." He leaned back, exhaling once. "We must set a deeper trap. For a hunter does not bare his teeth until cornered." Langley sat hunched in the stiff-backed chair of the parlour at Baker Street, his hands twisting a frayed handkerchief until it resembled nothing so much as a noose. The fire crackled softly behind him, but he seemed immune to its warmth. Holmes, standing by the mantel with his usual composure, observed the man with a gaze that made evasion impossible. "I was paid to conceal it," Langley said at last, his voice hoarse with fatigue and fear. "That is all." "Conceal what?" Holmes prompted, gently but implacably. Langley's lips parted, then closed again. It was as though even the truth choked him. "I did not see it done. I swear. Only after. I came upon the scene and was told that there had been an accident, a fight, nothing more." "And who told you this story?" Holmes asked, folding his arms. Langley hesitated. He never gave a name. He paid in gold and said I was to keep the bundle hidden, to forget I'd ever seen it. Gold for silence, Holmes murmured. And what did he look like? But Langley only shook his head. Whether in fear or ignorance I could not tell. Very well, Holmes said. You have confirmed only what I already knew, that you are not the architect, but merely the brush used to sweep the evidence beneath the floorboards. Langley gave a dry sob and looked down at his stained fingers. I didn't want to be part of it, he whispered. I truly didn't. Holmes turned from him, and his voice was quiet but steel-bound. And yet, Mr. Langley, you were. It was shortly after Langley had been escorted from the parlour that Holmes summoned me again, this time with a folder of yellowed military correspondence clutched in his hand. There is, Watson, he said, a peculiar satisfaction in watching the past unearth the present. He laid the folder open upon the table, revealing a faded photograph of a man in regimental dress, tall, proud, with a familiar glint of arrogance in the eye. Colonel Hargrave, I said, startled. Holmes nodded. Or rather, he was once known as Colonel Hargrave. Before that name was stricken from the rolls, he tapped the corner of a folded court-martial transcript. This man was dismissed in disgrace from the King's Rifles 15 years ago for conduct unbecoming of an officer, gambling debts, falsified reports, an ignoble end to a career once considered brilliant. And the name Hargrave? Assumed upon his return to England. He vanished after his dismissal and reappeared in Bloomsbury 5 years later under the new name. By all accounts, he has lived modestly since, until Sutton arrived. Holmes's expression darkened. Major Sutton was no fool. He recognised the man at once and began to dig. That sealed his fate. I felt the cold touch of dread pass through me. You believe Hargrave killed him? I do, Holmes said. Not from malice, but from fear. Cowards, Watson, make the most dangerous criminals. They strike only when their mask begins to slip. The pieces, once scattered, now formed a picture, as terrible as it was clear. Hargrave, once Harcourt, once a decorated officer, had lived under a borrowed name in a house of thin walls and thinner trust. When Sutton, by chance or purpose, recognised the disgraced man, the old life threatened to rise again like a tide of shame. Holmes laid out the steps with clinical precision. Sutton had begun asking questions. He wrote to old regiments, compared faces, gathered fragments. He confronted Hargrave, quietly, perhaps even privately, and offered him a choice, confession or exposure. I stared into the hearth, trying to imagine the scene. A confrontation, I said. A moment's panic. Holmes nodded. Precisely. Hargrave struck, a single blow perhaps, or something more brutal. But it was not premeditated. No killer with a plan would leave so much blood. And then? He sealed the wall, Holmes said simply. There had once been a brick chimney void along the 6th floor. He used plaster and lath, and Langley to tidy what he could not conceal. He turned toward the window, where the fog pressed like a curtain of ghosts. It is the crime of a man cornered by memory. He did not kill to destroy, but to preserve the illusion he had built from the ruin of his former life. And now? Holmes's jaw tightened. Now we remove the illusion, brick by brick. The following morning, under Holmes's direction, we returned to the boarding house with 2 constables and a workman in tow. The tenants remained sequestered in their rooms, though a tense quiet pressed down upon the walls like the stillness before a storm. Holmes led us to the 6th floor. At the far end of the corridor, opposite the room where the bundle had been found, he tapped twice upon the panelled wall. Here, he said. The workman produced his tools and began carefully to remove the outer plaster. Within moments, the flat of the chisel met resistance, wood, and behind it, something more solid. The panel gave way, and there, behind a layer of plaster and aged boards, was the body. Major Sutton, his features waxen, his skin pale as parchment, lay in repose within a cavity scarcely larger than a coffin. His uniform, though creased and discoloured, was unmistakable. Military dress, complete with faded medals upon the breast. One arm lay folded across the chest, the other twisted beneath him. No vermin had touched him. No decay had yet taken full hold. Death had come quickly, and concealment followed swiftly after. The room was silent as we gazed upon him. Holmes did not speak until the constable covered the body with a sheet. "Let no man say," he murmured, "that honour can be hidden beneath paint and timber. It has a habit of returning." Colonel Hargrave was found in his parlour, seated before a half-finished decanter of port, his eyes fixed on some far horizon of thought. When the constables entered, he did not rise. Holmes stepped forward. "The wall has given you up, Colonel." Hargrave said nothing. He only exhaled, slowly, like a man whose breath had been held too long, and placed his glass carefully upon the side table. Then he stood, straight-backed, and offered his wrists. No protest, no denial. As the irons clicked into place, he spoke at last, not to Holmes or the police, but to himself. "They would have taken everything," he whispered. "Everything I rebuilt." I looked to Holmes, who watched with neither pity nor triumph. For once, even his brilliance was silent in the face of such quiet ruin. The fog had not yet lifted from the city when Holmes and I returned once more to the familiar hearth of Baker Street. Though the case had closed upon a note of grim resolution, Holmes appeared neither triumphant nor weary, merely restored to that quiet detachment which always settled upon him after the mental strains of pursuit. He reclined in his chair with fingertips pressed together, his gaze turned to the faint dance of flame upon the coals. Outside, the cries of milkmen and the clatter of hooves heralded the beginning of a new day. Yet within, it was as though the world had momentarily paused to allow for contemplation. "I trust," he said at length, "that you have taken note of the greater pattern, Watson. This was no mere puzzle of blood and identity. It was a lesson in the art of shadows." I made no reply, for I had long since learned that such pronouncements signalled the beginning of Holmes's final reckoning, the slow unwinding of every thread into the complete tapestry of truth. He leaned forward slightly. The scream, the coin, the ash, even the silence, each told its tale, if one only knew how to listen. Holmes stood, retrieved the bundle of papers from the side table, and began sorting them into precise stacks as he spoke. "The plan was as simple as it was desperate," he said. "Hargrave, or rather, the man who once bore that name, required secrecy above all else. When Sutton recognized him, the illusion was threatened. But murder, Watson, was not his first instinct. It was a consequence of fear, a reflex, not a design." He gestured to the documents. The 6th floor was not under renovation. That was a fiction Hargrave himself concocted, allowing him to isolate a space within the house that no one would question. The scream Miss Merton heard was Sutton's death knell, silenced by disbelief and routine denial. "And Langley?" "Useful," Holmes replied. The man's debts were many, his pride greater still. Offered coin and vague assurances, he accepted the role of silent accomplice. He did not know the true nature of what he concealed, or so I allow myself to believe. Holmes's tone, though even, carried the faintest tinge of disdain. "And the trap? Merely the announcement of a police inspection. The guilty do not fear interrogation half as much as they fear exposure." He returned to his seat and drew a long breath. The moment Hargrave read that letter, he knew he had hours, not days, and so he sent Langley to retrieve what he could, and in doing so, unmasked them both. Holmes turned toward the window, where morning light had begun to trace soft lines across the curtains. "It was Miss Merton's account," he said quietly, that first fixed the compass of the truth. The scream, I asked. He nodded. Yes, it was real. Sutton died in that moment. Of that there is no doubt. The others in the house, whether from slumber, distraction, or willful ignorance, heard nothing or chose not to admit it. But Miss Merton heard. He folded his hands again. I have often said that facts are the bricks, but perception is the mortar. Without her conviction, her refusal to be dismissed as fanciful, we might never have turned our gaze toward the 6th floor at all. I reflected upon that lonely figure, quiet, uncertain, yet steadfast in her memory of what had occurred. She believed her senses, Holmes added, when others placed more faith in decorum. That made her singular. He paused, then added, and it made her right. Holmes poured 2 fingers of brandy into his glass, though he did not drink from it. Langley, he said, is a man whose conscience outruns his courage. I knew the type. Many in London's undercurrents bore that same haunted look, the shame of compliance without the resolve to resist. He accepted coin in place of clarity, Holmes continued. A coward's transaction, but not a criminal's mind. He feared poverty more than conscience, and only realized too late which of the two would consume him. He will not be charged. Holmes shook his head. Complicity, perhaps. But the law draws distinctions between those who strike the blow and those who simply refuse to ask where it landed. I sensed no pity in Holmes's voice, only a kind of weary acknowledgement, as if he had seen the shape of Langley's failure countless times before. He was not a villain, Holmes murmured, merely available. Holmes reached for his pipe, tapping it gently against the hearth before speaking again. There is, I think, a rare clarity in Miss Merton's character. I looked up, surprised. Praise from Holmes, especially of the earnest and unremarkable, was no small thing. She saw the shadow before the shape, he said, and did not look away. I nodded. She was brave. She was perceptive, Holmes corrected. Bravery without observation is impulse. She had both. He struck a match and lit the pipe, the smoke curling upward like an unwritten epilogue. She gave us the thread. I merely followed it. It was not until 10:30 that Inspector Lestrade arrived, breathless and self-important, his boots still damp from the cobblestones. "Well, Mr. Holmes," he announced, "I've come on urgent word from the yard, something about a deserter and a suspicious incident in Bloomsbury." Holmes did not rise. He merely gestured to the folder on the side table. "You'll find the body, the motive, and the confession all in there," he said. "Do let me know if I've missed anything." Lestrade blinked. "But how?" Holmes exhaled a slow ribbon of smoke. "Justice, Inspector," he said. "It rarely waits for paperwork. There are few sights more pitiable, and yet more sobering, than that of a man laid low, not by age, nor by illness, but by the erosion of his own design." As I sat across from Holmes that morning, with the events of the past week laid bare, my thoughts turned to Colonel Hargrave. Once resplendent in regimental dress, later wrapped in falsehood like a second skin. He had worn the disguise of respectability as if it were armour, and yet, when tested, it proved as brittle as ash. His crime had not been born of vice or malice, but of cowardice, the fear of exposure, the dread of watching a hard-forged lie crumble into dust. That fear had driven his hand to murder, and then to silence, and still, I could not wholly hate the man. There had been something in the rigidity of his final stance, in the way he surrendered not with defiance, but with a soldier's acceptance, that spoke of a life once lived with honour, however long since it had slipped from his grasp. Pride had led him astray, yes, but it had also kept him from pleading, from fleeing, from dishonouring what little remained. I thought of the medals still pinned to the body of Major Sutton, cold and unmoving behind that false wall. One man had died for truth, the other had killed for the illusion of it. Both had been soldiers once, but only one had remained one to the end. The fire had burned low in the grate, and Holmes, as was his habit in moments of post-mortem reflection, sat with his eyes fixed not upon me, but upon the last glowing coal, as though reading some silent code in its disintegration. "Strange," I said, breaking the hush between us. "How much may be hidden behind so little? A wall, a rug, a name." Holmes did not move for a time. Then, without shifting his gaze, he spoke. "There is no such thing as permanence in deception, Watson. Only delay." He tapped the ash from his pipe. "Dust and plaster, yes, they may muffle a scream, bury a body, even delay a reckoning. But truth is of a different order. It waits." There was a gravity in his voice then, something rare and heavy that settled into the room like mist. "You may overlay it with lies, entomb it with fear, but it is not undone. Not truly. It merely sleeps, until something, an intuition, a thread, a cry in the night, summons it forth again." I nodded slowly, for I'd seen it with my own eyes. A floor sealed shut, a scream dismissed, a bundle buried beneath boards. And yet, every element, every lie, had been unravelled in time. Holmes turned to me at last. "We do not chase shadows, Watson. We chase the light that made them." The fog outside had lifted just enough to reveal the chimneys of Baker Street, their silhouettes stark against the wan light of dawn. The city yawned and stirred, and with it came the echo of normalcy. Carriage wheels, the bark of a street hawker, the clink of a milkman's bottles. Inside, the room remained still. "Holmes," I said after a pause, "do you believe justice was done?" He considered the question, then leaned forward to tamp his pipe, his movements unhurried. "Justice?" he repeated. "Yes, in form. The guilty revealed, the innocent acknowledged, the dead remembered." "And reputation?" I asked. "Can it ever coexist with truth?" He paused, then struck a match. "One is built on clarity," he said, the flame catching. "The other, I fear, on silence." The smoke rose slowly between us, grey, curling, ephemeral. "In the end," he added, "it is the silence that breaks first." I looked once more toward the window, where the first sunbeam caught the sill, and in that moment I understood that the greatest mysteries are not always those of motive or means, but of the fragile scaffolding upon which men build their names, and the quiet courage it takes to see them for what they are. As the case drew to its inevitable close, Holmes leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the embers of the dying fire, his hands steepled thoughtfully before him. "Watson," he said, his voice low yet sharp with the weight of his reflections. "It is a curious thing, this human penchant for preserving appearances. We see it in every corner of life, this desperate need to maintain a facade. Colonel Hargrave, in his downfall, was undone not by his past misdeeds, but by his fear of losing that which he had worked so hard to conceal. The truth always finds its way to the surface, in time. It waits. It is patient." I nodded, mulling over his words, the slow burn of realization creeping over me. "And yet," I said quietly, "it seems the price of maintaining that facade was his very soul." Holmes gave a slight nod, almost imperceptible, but laden with meaning. "Indeed. The greatest mistake we can make is to believe that silence will protect us. The truth, Watson, is not bound by walls or doors. It is a force unto itself, and no amount of subterfuge can stop it." I paused for a moment, turning to him. "What, then, was Hargrave's biggest mistake, Holmes?" Holmes met my gaze with a spark of quiet amusement. "His biggest mistake was not in killing Sutton, but in believing that a lie once spoken would not return to claim him. What do you think, Watson?" Was it pride or fear that drove him to that final act? As the last tendrils of smoke from Holmes's pipe curled into the air, I couldn't help but feel the weight of the lesson. What do you think was the greatest mistake made in this case? Was it the lie itself, or the silence that followed? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this mystery, be sure to subscribe and share it with your friends, so we can uncover more of these twisted tales together. The mystery, after all, never truly ends.